The silver bracelet that would destroy Dr. William Crawford's carefully constructed life was hiding in plain sight, wrapped around his wrist like a guilty secret, waiting for the one person who would recognize the name engraved on its inner surface. Sarah Mitchell's hands were steady as she prepared the cardiac catheter, but her mind was racing. 3 years since her grandfather Thomas had died suddenly, taking with him all the stories he'd promised to tell her when she was ready. 3 years since his belongings had mysteriously vanished from the hospital room before she could collect them. 3 years of questions that gnawed at her in the quiet moments between patients. "Focus, Mitchell." The sharp voice of Dr. William Crawford cut through her thoughts like a scalpel. Mr. Chambers' life depends on precision, not daydreaming. At 27, Sarah had learned to swallow her pride in moments like these. She'd grown up in Chicago's South Side, where respect was earned through grit and determination, not handed down with trust funds and Ivy League diplomas. But here, in the pristine halls of Chicago General, she was just another nurse, invisible until needed, disposable when convenient. "Yes, Dr. Crawford," she replied, her voice steady despite the familiar burn of humiliation. The other nurses in the OR avoided eye contact. They'd all been there, feeling small under the weight of his expectations, his subtle reminders of their place in the hospital hierarchy. Dr. Crawford was a legend at Chicago General. 45 years old, Harvard-educated, with a patient survival rate that made medical journals weep with envy. His donations to the hospital had funded an entire wing. Board members treated him like royalty. Patients fought to get on his surgery schedule. And nurses like Sarah? They were replaceable parts in his perfectly oiled machine. But Sarah had something Dr. Crawford didn't know about, a memory that had haunted her for 3 years. The night her grandfather died, he'd been wearing his silver bracelet, the one with his name engraved inside. "Promise me," he'd whispered with his final breath. "Promise me you'll remember who we are, Sarah girl. Promise me you won't let them erase us," she'd promised. But when she returned to collect his belongings the next morning, the bracelet was gone. The hospital staff claimed they had no record of any jewelry. Security footage had mysteriously malfunctioned. Even the attending physician from that night had suddenly transferred to another hospital. "The patient is prepped," Sarah announced, checking Mr. Chambers' vitals one final time. The elderly man reminded her of her grandfather, the same weathered hands, the same trusting eyes that believed doctors were angels sent from heaven. Dr. Crawford moved with surgical precision, his every gesture calculated and confident. Sarah had assisted him dozens of times over the past year, and she had to admit his skill was undeniable. But there was something about him that made her skin crawl, a coldness that had nothing to do with professional detachment. As he leaned over the patient to begin the procedure, Sarah caught a glint of silver beneath his surgical sleeve. Her breath caught in her throat. There, barely visible above his latex glove, was the edge of a bracelet. "Suction," Dr. Crawford ordered, and Sarah complied automatically, but her eyes remained fixed on that sliver of silver. Her heart hammered against her ribs as forbidden thoughts crept into her mind. It couldn't be. It was impossible. There were thousands of silver bracelets in the world. But as the procedure continued, Dr. Crawford occasionally adjusted his sleeve, and Sarah caught glimpses of engravings on the inner surface. Her grandfather had been obsessive about that bracelet, polishing it every Sunday morning while he told her stories about their family's history. She knew every scratch, every worn spot where the silver had been rubbed smooth by decades of wear. The surgery lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of pretending to focus on instruments and monitors while her world tilted on its axis. 3 hours of watching the man who'd built his reputation on healing people wear what might be a stolen piece of her family's legacy. When Mr. Chambers was wheeled to recovery, Dr. Crawford finally relaxed his posture. "Excellent work today, team," he announced, pulling off his surgical gloves with satisfaction. "The patient should make a full recovery." As he turned to leave, the bracelet caught the light again, and this time Sarah saw it clearly. Engraved in elegant script on the inner band were the words that confirmed her worst suspicions. Thomas Mitchell, 1952, her grandfather's bracelet. His name, his birth year, on the wrist of the most powerful man in the hospital. The surgical instruments in Sarah's hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The room spun slightly as the implications crashed over her like a wave. How did Dr. Crawford have her grandfather's bracelet? Why had he been wearing it like it belonged to him? And what did this mean about the night her grandfather died? As Dr. Crawford disappeared through the OR doors, Sarah realized that everything she thought she knew about her grandfather's death, everything she'd been told about his final hours, might have been a carefully constructed lie. The silver bracelet wasn't just a piece of jewelry anymore. It was evidence. Evidence of what she didn't know yet, but she was going to find out. The employee break room at Chicago General smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams, but it was the only place Sarah could think clearly, without the weight of white coats and stethoscopes pressing down on her shoulders. Her hands shook as she poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't want, her mind replaying the image of that silver bracelet over and over. Thomas Mitchell, 1952. The engraving was burned into her retinas like she'd stared too long at the sun. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she was jumping to conclusions, that there had to be an explanation. But her gut, the same instinct that had guided her through 5 years of nursing, whispered that something was very, very wrong. You look like you've seen a ghost. The familiar voice of Marcus Chen made Sarah's shoulders relax slightly. Marcus was one of the few people at Chicago General who treated her like an equal rather than hospital furniture. As the head of medical records, he had access to information that others couldn't touch, and more importantly, he had a moral compass that actually pointed north. "Maybe I have," Sarah murmured, sinking into one of the plastic chairs that had probably been donated sometime in the 1980s. Marcus studied her with the same analytical precision he brought to patient files. At 32, he'd seen enough hospital politics to know when something was eating at someone from the inside out. "Want to talk about it?" Sarah hesitated. What could she say? That she suspected the hospital's most decorated surgeon of stealing jewelry from a dead man? That she thought there might be a conspiracy surrounding her grandfather's death? It sounded insane even in her own head. "Do you remember 3 years ago when my grandfather died here?" she asked finally. "Thomas Mitchell. Room 247. Sudden cardiac arrest." Marcus's memory for details was legendary among the staff. "You were devastated. Took 2 weeks off. Did you ever see his file?" Marcus frowned. "Sarah, you know I can't discuss patient records, even if he was family. I'm not asking for details. I'm asking if you remember anything unusual about his case." The way Marcus's expression shifted told Sarah everything she needed to know. There had been something unusual. He glanced around the break room, making sure they were alone, then leaned closer. "Look, I probably shouldn't say this, but your grandfather's file went through some unusual handling. Dr. Crawford personally oversaw his case, which was strange because cardiac arrests usually go to whoever's on duty. And after he died," Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully, "the file was sealed faster than I'd ever seen before. Usually there's a process, paperwork, reviews, but his records were locked down within hours." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Locked down by who?" "Dr. Crawford's orders. Said it was for quality assurance review. 3 years later, is it still sealed?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. The coffee cup in Sarah's hands suddenly felt scalding hot. She set it down with trembling fingers, her mind racing through the implications. Her grandfather's file was sealed. Dr. Crawford had personally handled his case, and now Dr. Crawford was wearing her grandfather's bracelet, like it was his own personal trophy. "Marcus," she said quietly, "if I needed to see that file, hypothetically, would there be a way?" "Sarah," Marcus's voice carried a warning, "whatever you're thinking, be careful. Dr. Crawford isn't just any doctor here. He's practically untouchable. The board treats him like he walks on water. That's exactly why I need to be careful." Sarah met his eyes. "My grandfather was the most important person in my life. The night he died, he was wearing a silver bracelet, a family heirloom. When I came back for his belongings, it was gone. Everyone claimed they'd never seen it." She took a shaky breath. "Today, during surgery, I saw that bracelet on Dr. Crawford's wrist. It had my grandfather's name engraved inside." Marcus stared at her, like she'd just told him she'd seen Elvis in the cafeteria. "Sarah, that's a serious accusation. I know what I saw, Marcus. The question is, what am I going to do about it?" For a long moment, the only sound in the break room was the hum of the ancient refrigerator. Marcus drummed his fingers on the table, a habit he'd developed when wrestling with difficult decisions. "You know what this could mean for your career if you're wrong," he said finally. "And you know what it means for my soul if I'm right and I do nothing." Marcus studied her face, seeing something there that made his expression soften. Sarah had always been different from the other nurses, not just in her dedication to patients, but in her inability to look the other way when something felt wrong. It was a quality that made her an exceptional nurse and a terrible politician. "The files are in the basement archive," he said quietly. "Level B3. Security is lighter on night shifts." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that if someone were to accidentally drop their ID badge near the archive door, and if that someone were to discover it was accidentally programmed with higher access levels than normal," Marcus shrugged. "Mistakes happen." The weight of what he was offering hit Sarah like a physical blow. Marcus was risking his job, his career, everything he'd worked for. And he was doing it based on nothing more than her word and his own sense that something wasn't right. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he'd never asked aloud. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stay quiet," he said finally. "And because your grandfather came to my office once, about 6 months before he died. He wanted to know about medical ethics procedures, how to report concerns about patient care. He seemed scared, Sarah, really scared. The break room suddenly felt too small, too warm. Sarah's vision blurred slightly as the implications crashed over her. Her grandfather had been investigating something that scared him, something that might have gotten him killed. "What did you tell him?" she managed to ask. "I gave him the standard information. But I also told him to be careful, that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who can hurt us worst." Marcus met her eyes. "I've regretted not pushing harder ever since." Sarah stood up, her legs unsteady but her resolve crystallizing like steel. "When?" "Tonight. Midnight shift change. 3rd floor break room." Marcus pulled out his wallet and slid his ID badge across the table. "You didn't get this from me." As Sarah pocketed the badge, she realized there was no going back. She was crossing a line that would either lead to the truth about her grandfather's death or destroy everything she'd worked for. But as she thought about her grandfather's final words, "Promise me you won't let them erase us," she knew she didn't have a choice. Some promises were worth risking everything to keep. The basement of Chicago General at midnight felt like a tomb. Sarah's footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as she made her way to level B3, Marcus's ID badge burning like a brand in her pocket. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows that made her jump at every corner. She'd spent the last 8 hours going through the motions of her shift, checking vitals, administering medications, comforting patients while her mind churned with questions. Every time she'd seen Dr. Crawford in the halls, her eyes had automatically gone to his wrist, looking for that flash of silver beneath his sleeve. Each glimpse confirmed what she'd seen in the OR, her grandfather's bracelet, worn like a victory trophy by the man who'd supposedly tried to save his life. The archive door stood before her like a guardian of secrets. Sarah's hands trembled as she swiped Marcus's badge, half expecting alarms to sound, security guards to appear, her career to end in spectacular disgrace. Instead, the door clicked open with a soft electronic beep. The archive room was larger than she'd expected, filled with towering shelves of medical files that stretched back decades. The air smelled of dust and old paper, like a library that time had forgotten. Sarah pulled out her phone's flashlight and began searching for the section marked M for Mitchell. Her grandfather's file was exactly where it should be, but when Sarah pulled it from the shelf, her heart sank. The folder was thin, too thin for someone who'd been a patient for 3 days before his death. Most cardiac arrest cases generated dozens of pages of documentation. This file felt like it contained maybe 5 or 6 sheets. With shaking hands, she opened the folder under her phone's light. The first page was a standard admission form. Thomas Mitchell, age 72, admitted with chest pains at 3:47 p.m. on March 15th. But as Sarah read further, inconsistencies began to leap off the page like red flags. According to the chart, her grandfather had been stable upon admission, with normal vitals and no immediate signs of cardiac distress. That wasn't the story she'd been told. Dr. Crawford's notes, written in his distinctive handwriting, painted a picture of a man in severe cardiac crisis from the moment of arrival. But the nursing notes, written by different staff members, told a completely different story. They described a patient who was alert, conversational, even asking about his granddaughter who worked upstairs in the cardiac unit. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her grandfather had been asking about her. He'd known she worked in the hospital, but Dr. Crawford had told her that her grandfather never regained consciousness after his initial collapse. Another lie. She flipped to the next page and found something that made her blood freeze. A medication administration record, signed by Dr. Crawford personally. Not the usual cardiac medications she'd expect to see, but a combination of drugs that seemed strange for a heart attack patient. Her nursing training kicked in as she recognized the names: Versed for sedation, Vecuronium for paralysis, and most disturbing of all, a massive dose of potassium chloride. Any one of those drugs could be medically justified in certain circumstances, but together, in those dosages, they formed a combination that would be lethal to someone with a healthy heart, much less someone experiencing cardiac distress. Sarah's hands shook so violently she could barely hold the file. Potassium chloride was notorious in medical circles. It was the drug used in lethal injections. In high doses, it would stop a heart in minutes, and if administered correctly, it would be virtually undetectable in a routine autopsy. She forced herself to keep reading, though every page made her feel sicker. The timeline didn't add up. According to Dr. Crawford's notes, her grandfather had died at 11:23 p.m. after hours of unsuccessful resuscitation attempts. But the nursing notes showed that all monitoring equipment had been disconnected at 9:15 p.m. and no nurses had been present in the room after 9:30. Someone had been alone with her grandfather. For nearly 2 hours before his official time of death, the final page in the file was a request for immediate cremation, signed by Dr. Crawford as attending physician and countersigned by someone whose signature was illegible. The request was dated less than 12 hours after her grandfather's death, highly unusual, considering that most families needed days or weeks to make arrangements. But the most chilling detail was at the bottom of the page, a note that all personal effects had been disposed of per hospital protocol due to contamination risk. Contamination risk. That was how they'd explained away her grandfather's missing belongings. That was how they'd justified taking his bracelet, his wallet, his wedding ring, everything that might have told a story Dr. Crawford didn't want told. Sarah sank into a nearby chair, the weight of the evidence crushing down on her like a physical force. Her grandfather hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd been murdered, and the man responsible was walking the halls of Chicago General, wearing his victim's jewelry like a sick souvenir. But why? What could her grandfather have possibly known that was worth killing for? She flipped back through the file, looking for anything she might have missed, and found it tucked behind the cremation request, a single sheet of paper that didn't belong with the medical records. It was a handwritten letter addressed to Sarah, "My dear girl," in her grandfather's distinctive script. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and Dr. Crawford's secrets are darker than I ever imagined. I've been investigating irregularities in the cardiac unit, patients who should have survived but didn't, families who asked too many questions and were told to be quiet. The bracelet you love so much isn't just a family heirloom, Sarah. It's evidence. Hidden inside the clasp is a memory card with copies of files that Crawford thought he'd destroyed. Files that prove he's been killing patients for their organ donations, selling hearts and kidneys to the highest bidders. I was going to turn him in, but if you're reading this, then I didn't get the chance. The combination to open the clasp is your birthday, 0827. Be careful who you trust, my dear girl. And remember, you have healing hands, but sometimes healing means cutting out the disease." Sarah stared at the letter until the words blurred through her tears. Her grandfather had known. He'd discovered Dr. Crawford's operation and had been killed for it. But before he died, he'd hidden evidence in the one place Crawford would never think to look, inside the very bracelet he'd stolen as a trophy. The bracelet that was currently wrapped around Dr. Crawford's wrist. Sarah carefully folded the letter and tucked it into her scrubs, then closed the file and returned it to its place on the shelf. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes healing means cutting out the disease. Dr. Crawford had made one crucial mistake. He'd kept the bracelet, worn it like a symbol of his power over life and death. But that symbol was about to become the key to his destruction. Sarah Mitchell had entered the basement as a grieving granddaughter seeking answers. She was leaving as a woman with a mission. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in her small apartment, staring at her grandfather's letter, until the words were burned into her memory. While the weight of what she'd discovered settled into her bones like lead, Dr. William Crawford wasn't just a thief, he was a killer. A man who'd built his reputation on the bodies of patients he'd murdered for their organs. The morning shift at Chicago General felt different now, like she was seeing everything through new eyes. Every smile from Dr. Crawford felt like a threat. Every patient he visited made her stomach clench with worry. She found herself watching his hands obsessively, noting when he touched patients, when he reached for medications, when that silver bracelet caught the light beneath his sleeve. "You look terrible," Marcus observed when she passed him in the corridor. His eyes held a question she couldn't answer in public, surrounded by ears that might be listening. "Didn't sleep well," she replied, which was true enough. "Maybe you should take a personal day," Sarah almost laughed at the suggestion. Take a day off while a murderer walked free, while patients lay vulnerable in beds, trusting the very man who might decide their organs were worth more than their lives. "I'm fine," she lied, but she wasn't fine. She was terrified and angry and completely out of her depth. What was a Southside nurse supposed to do with knowledge that could destroy the hospital's golden boy? Who could she tell? The police would laugh at her. The hospital administration would fire her before she finished speaking. And Dr. Crawford had enough power and influence to make her disappear, just like her grandfather had. The answer came to her during lunch break. As she sat in the cafeteria picking at a sandwich she couldn't taste, Dr. Crawford entered with his usual entourage of residents and medical students, holding court like a king among his subjects. They hung on his every word as he described a complex surgery, his hands gesturing elegantly as he explained the delicate art of saving lives. Sarah watched those hands and thought about what they'd done to her grandfather, what they'd probably done to dozens of other patients over the years. The bracelet glinted on his wrist like a beacon of guilt, and for a moment, Sarah entertained the fantasy of simply walking over and ripping it off his arm in front of everyone. But that would solve nothing. Even if she could open the clasp and retrieve the memory card her grandfather had hidden inside, the evidence would be meaningless without context. She needed to understand the full scope of Crawford's operation. She needed proof that would be impossible to dismiss or cover up. She needed help from someone with more power than a floor nurse could ever hope to wield. The realization hit her like lightning. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the hospital's new cardiac surgeon, she'd arrived from Johns Hopkins 6 months ago, brought in to head the heart transplant program. Sarah had worked with her several times and had been impressed by her meticulous attention to detail and her genuine concern for patient welfare. More importantly, Dr. Vasquez had been asking uncomfortable questions about the cardiac unit's patient outcomes, questions that had made Dr. Crawford visibly irritated during staff meetings. If anyone would listen to Sarah's story and have the authority to do something about it, it would be Dr. Vasquez. The afternoon passed in a blur of routine tasks that felt anything but routine. Every interaction with Dr. Crawford was loaded with new meaning. When he complimented her efficiency during a procedure, Sarah heard the condescension of a man who thought he was untouchable. When he adjusted his sleeve and the bracelet shifted, she wanted to scream that it didn't belong to him. At 4 p.m., Sarah found Dr. Vasquez in her office, reviewing surgical notes. The office was spartanly decorated, just a few medical texts, a photo of what looked like family, and diplomas that spoke of academic excellence rather than social connections. "Dr. Vasquez, could I speak with you privately?" Elena looked up, her dark eyes immediately assessing. She was in her early 40s, with graying temples that spoke of years spent fighting for every patient's life. There was something about her presence that reminded Sarah of her grandfather, a quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. "Of course." Sarah closed the door. Sarah's hands shook as she settled into the chair across from Elena's desk. Now that the moment was here, the magnitude of what she was about to do felt overwhelming. She was about to accuse the hospital's most powerful physician of multiple murders. There would be no taking it back. "Dr. Vasquez, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound insane." Elena leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral but attentive. Try me. Sarah took a deep breath and began with her grandfather's death 3 years ago. She described the missing belongings, the sealed medical file, the inconsistencies in his treatment record. Elena's expression grew increasingly grave as Sarah continued, but she didn't interrupt. When Sarah reached the part about seeing her grandfather's bracelet on Dr. Crawford's wrist, Elena's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. That's a serious accusation, Sarah. I know, but there's more. Sarah pulled out her grandfather's letter, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. I found this in his medical file. Elena read the letter twice, her expression darkening with each word. When she finished, she set it down carefully and steepled her fingers. A gesture Sarah had seen her make when contemplating complex surgical decisions. Your grandfather mentions organ donations, Elena said finally. That's been bothering me since I arrived here. Our cardiac unit has an unusually high rate of donor organs, but a correspondingly low rate of successful recoveries. The numbers don't add up. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. You've noticed it too? I've been documenting discrepancies for months. Patients who should survive don't. Families who ask questions get transferred to other hospitals. And Dr. Crawford personally handles all the organ procurement protocols. Eleanor paused, her expression grim. I've been building a case, but I needed more evidence. The memory card, Sarah whispered. My grandfather said he hid evidence in the bracelet, which is currently on Dr. Crawford's wrist. Elena stood and began pacing, her mind clearly working through the implications. Sarah, if what your grandfather documented is true, we're talking about a conspiracy that could go back years. Dozens of victims, millions of dollars in illegal organ sales. What do we do? Eleanor stopped pacing and turned to face her. We get that bracelet, and we bring down the man who thinks he's above the law. For the first time since discovering her grandfather's letter, Sarah felt something other than fear coursing through her veins. She felt hope. The plan Dr. Vasquez proposed was audacious and terrifying in equal measure. It hinged on the hospital's annual charity gala, scheduled for Saturday night, an event where Chicago's medical elite would gather to celebrate their contributions to healing, while Dr. Crawford would be at the center of attention, basking in accolades for his life-saving work. Crawford never removes that bracelet, Eleanor explained as they huddled in her office Friday evening, the hospital quiet around them. I've watched him for months. He wears it during surgeries, meetings, even formal events. It's like a talisman to him. Sarah nodded, remembering how the bracelet had been visible even beneath his surgical gloves. So how do we get it off him? We don't. We get him to take it off himself. Elena pulled out a folder thick with documents. I've been investigating the organ procurement timeline. Crawford always schedules his emergency organ harvesting procedures for late evening, when fewer staff are around to witness the process. The gala starts at 8. If we can create a situation where he needs to perform immediate surgery, he'll have to remove the bracelet for scrubbing in, Sarah finished, understanding dawning. Standard surgical protocol. Exactly. And you'll be the scrub nurse assigned to assist him. Sarah's stomach clenched. The thought of being alone in an operating room with her grandfather's killer made her feel physically ill, but she forced herself to focus. What about the patient? We can't put someone in danger just to... No patient, Elena interrupted. We're going to stage a medical emergency. Someone is going to collapse at the gala. Someone who needs immediate cardiac intervention that only Dr. Crawford can provide. While he's scrubbing, you retrieve the bracelet from the surgical prep area and open the clasp. It was elegant in its simplicity, but Sarah could see a dozen ways it could go wrong. What if he notices the bracelet is gone? He won't have time. The moment you've secured the memory card, we'll have hospital security present Crawford with the evidence in front of the gala attendees. No opportunity for him to destroy anything or silence anyone. Sarah stared at the documents spread across Elena's desk. Months of careful investigation, patient files, financial records that showed suspicious patterns of organ procurement. Eleanor had been building this case piece by piece, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah's discovery had simply provided the final piece of the puzzle. Dr. Vasquez, Sarah said quietly, why are you risking everything for this? You barely knew my grandfather. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the patient files. Because 3 months ago I operated on a 16-year-old boy named David Santos. Car accident, massive cardiac trauma, but survivable with proper intervention. I was supposed to perform the surgery, But Crawford pulled rank, said he'd handle it personally. Her voice hardened. That boy died on the table, and Crawford had his heart harvested within hours. The family was told it was complications from the accident. Sarah felt sick. But you don't think it was? I reviewed the surgical notes afterward. David should have lived, but Crawford used the same drug combination I've seen in a dozen other cases. Patients who died despite having every reason to survive. Eleanor met Sarah's eyes. Your grandfather wasn't Crawford's first victim, Sarah, and if we don't stop him, he won't be the last. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a lead blanket. She thought about all the patients she'd seen Crawford treat over the past year, all the families who'd trusted him with their most precious possessions, their loved ones' lives. How many of those families had gone home planning funerals instead of recoveries? What do you need me to do? She asked. Elena smiled grimly. Tomorrow night, you're going to help me save a lot of lives by ending one man's reign of terror. They spent the next 2 hours going over every detail of the plan. Elena had already arranged for Marcus to be working the Saturday night shift, giving them an ally in medical records if they needed to access additional files quickly. She'd also contacted a friend in the FBI's healthcare fraud division, someone who'd been investigating unusual organ trafficking patterns in Chicago hospitals. Agent Morrison will be at the gala, Elena explained. She'll be posing as a potential donor's wife. The moment we have the evidence from the memory card, she'll take Crawford into custody. Sarah's head spun with the complexity of it all. This feels like something out of a movie. The best plans often do. Eleanor gathered the documents and locked them in her desk drawer. Sarah, I need you to understand something. Once we do this, there's no going back. Crawford will be finished, but the scandal will rock this hospital to its foundation. There will be investigations, media attention, lawsuits. Your life is going to change dramatically. Sarah thought about her grandfather's final words, about the promise she'd made to not let them be erased. She thought about David Santos and all the other victims whose families deserved to know the truth. My life already changed the night my grandfather died, she said. I just didn't know it yet. Elena nodded, understanding something in Sarah's expression that went beyond words. Get some rest tomorrow. What we're about to do will require every ounce of strength and courage you have. As Sarah left Elena's office, she felt a strange mixture of terror and anticipation coursing through her veins. In less than 24 hours, she would either expose one of the most elaborate medical conspiracies in Chicago's history or destroy her own life in the attempt. But as she walked through the quiet hospital corridors, passing the rooms where patients slept peacefully, trusting that their doctors would keep them safe, Sarah knew she'd made the right choice. Some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost, and this was definitely one of them. The Chicago General Charity Gala transformed the hospital's main atrium into a glittering showcase of wealth and medical prestige. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in pristine white linen. While Chicago's elite mingled in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, their conversations flowing as freely as the champagne. Sarah adjusted her black evening dress borrowed from her roommate and altered with safety pins and tried to blend into the crowd of servers circulating with silver trays. The plan required her to be invisible until the crucial moment, just another hospital employee grateful to witness the celebration of their betters. Dr. Crawford stood at the center of it all, resplendent in his custom tuxedo, the silver bracelet glinting beneath his French cuffs as he gestured while telling another story of surgical triumph. Sarah's stomach clenched every time she caught sight of it. Her grandfather's bracelet, the key to justice for Thomas Mitchell and all of Crawford's other victims. Breathe, Marcus whispered as he passed by, carrying a tray of canapes. He'd volunteered for catering duty to provide extra cover for their operation. You look like you're about to faint, Sarah nodded, forcing herself to focus on the plan. Dr. Vasquez was across the room, elegant in navy blue silk, chatting with hospital board members while keeping one eye on the clock. Agent Morrison, the FBI contact, was positioned near the main entrance, her cover as a donor's wife providing perfect justification for her presence. At exactly 9:15 p.m., as Crawford began his keynote speech about the sacred trust between doctors and patients, Eleanor excused herself from her table and headed toward the restrooms. Sarah counted to 60, then followed. The women's bathroom was empty except for Elena, who was bent over the sink, her face pale with what looked like genuine distress. "Are you ready?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled a small makeup compact from her purse. Hidden inside, where powder should have been, was a tiny vial of ipecac syrup, a substance that would induce violent but harmless vomiting within minutes of consumption. "This feels wrong," Sarah said. "Making someone sick, even temporarily. It's temporary discomfort to stop a serial killer," Elena replied firmly. "And I volunteered, remember? Better me than risking an innocent bystander." Elena was right. She'd insisted on being the one to fake the medical emergency, arguing that her medical knowledge would help her simulate symptoms convincingly while avoiding actual danger. Elena took the vial with steady hands and downed its contents in one quick gulp. "5 minutes," she said. "Then showtime." They returned to the gala separately. Sarah positioned herself near the kitchen entrance while Eleanor rejoined her table, engaging in animated conversation with the hospital's chief of staff. Sarah watched the clock on her phone. 9:18. "Size 18, 1920. Dr. Crawford was in the middle of describing his latest surgical innovation when Elena suddenly doubled over, her face going green. She gripped the table edge, then lurched toward the bathroom but collapsed halfway there. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Guests screamed. Board members rushed to Elena's side. Someone shouted for a doctor, which was almost comical given that half the room contained physicians, but it was Dr. Crawford who took charge, his commanding presence parting the crowd like Moses at the Red Sea. "Give her space," he ordered, kneeling beside Elena's convulsing form. "Someone call an ambulance." "No time," Elena gasped between retches, playing her part perfectly. "Cardiac symptoms, need surgery." Sarah's heart hammered as Crawford immediately shifted into emergency mode. His ego wouldn't allow another doctor to handle such a high-profile medical crisis, especially not in front of the hospital's biggest donors. "Prep or 7, he barked at a nearby resident. "Full cardiac team now." As attendees buzzed with concern and excitement, Crawford helped carry Elena toward the elevators. Sarah slipped away from the crowd, taking the service elevator to the surgical floor, while the main elevator carried Crawford and his entourage. The surgical prep area was exactly as Elena had described, sterile, bright, and equipped with locked cabinets where surgeons stored personal items during procedures. Sarah's hands shook as she used Marcus's override codes to access the security system, disabling the cameras in the prep room for exactly 3 minutes. Through the observation window, she watched Crawford bark orders at nurses and residents as they prepared Elena for what everyone believed was emergency cardiac surgery. Elena was conscious but playing her symptoms perfectly, moaning about chest pain and shortness of breath. Then came the moment Sarah had been waiting for. Crawford turned to scrub in, and according to hospital protocol, all jewelry had to be removed before entering the sterile environment. Sarah held her breath as Crawford approached the sink. With practiced efficiency, he began removing his watch, his wedding ring, and finally the silver bracelet. He placed all 3 items in a small metal tray, then began the meticulous hand-washing ritual that preceded every surgery. This was it, Sarah's one chance. She slipped into the prep area, her soft-soled shoes silent on the polished floor. The bracelet lay in the tray like a sleeping snake, innocent-looking, but carrying the potential to destroy a killer's carefully constructed life. With trembling fingers, Sarah lifted the bracelet and found the tiny clasp her grandfather had described. It took her 3 attempts to enter her birthday, EOA27, into the microscopic digital lock. But finally the clasp sprang open, hidden inside, exactly as her grandfather had promised, was a memory card smaller than her fingernail. Sarah palmed the card and quickly closed the clasp, returning the bracelet to its place in the tray. She was back in the hallway before Crawford finished scrubbing, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. But she'd done it. After 3 years of questions and grief, she finally had the evidence that would expose her grandfather's killer. Through the observation window, she watched Crawford enter the OR, completely unaware that his reign of terror was about to end. Helena caught her eye through the glass and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Phase 1 was complete. Now came the hard part. As Sarah made her way toward the elevator, the memory card burning like a coal in her palm, she thought about her grandfather's final words. Sometimes healing means cutting out the disease. Tonight, Chicago General was finally going to be healed. The hospital's computer lab hummed quietly as Sarah inserted her grandfather's memory card into the workstation. Marcus sat beside her, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he bypassed security protocols with the ease of someone who'd spent years navigating the hospital's digital infrastructure. "My God," Marcus whispered as files began populating the screen. "Sarah, look at this." What they discovered was worse than even Sarah's darkest suspicions. The memory card contained 3 years' worth of meticulously documented evidence, patient files, financial records, email communications, and most damning of all, video footage from hidden cameras her grandfather had apparently installed in his room during his final days. The videos showed Dr. Crawford entering Thomas Mitchell's room alone, administering injections that weren't listed in any medical chart, and having hushed phone conversations about procurement schedules and delivery timelines. In one particularly chilling recording, Crawford could be heard saying, "The old man figured out too much. This one's personal insurance." "He killed him," Sarah breathed, watching her grandfather's final moments play out on screen. "He actually killed him because Grandpa discovered the organ trafficking operation." Marcus scrolled through financial documents that painted a picture of staggering corruption. Dr. Crawford had been selling organs on the black market for at least 5 years, earning millions of dollars from wealthy patients willing to pay premium prices for immediate transplants. Patients who should have recovered were instead pronounced brain dead, their organs harvested and sold to the highest bidders. The scope was breathtaking. Crawford had connections to organ brokers in 3 countries, a network of corrupt morticians who falsified cause-of-death reports, and even offshore accounts where his blood money was laundered through fake medical research foundations. "David Santos," Marcus said, pointing to a file dated 3 months ago. The 16-year-old Dr. Vasquez mentioned. "Look at this." The boy's file contained Crawford's handwritten notes about the quality of donor, materials, and a payment receipt for $800,000, transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands. David hadn't died from complications. He'd been murdered for his young, healthy heart. Sarah felt sick as they scrolled through dozens of similar cases. Elderly patients like her grandfather, who'd asked too many questions. Young accident victims with rare blood types. Even children whose parents had been told their loved ones couldn't be saved. "There are at least 40 victims here," Marcus said grimly. "Maybe more. And Crawford is downstairs right now, probably planning Dr. Vasquez's tragic death during surgery," Sarah replied. "We need to stop this now." But as they prepared to transmit the evidence to Agent Morrison, alarms began blaring throughout the hospital. Emergency lights flashed red in the corridors, and an automated voice announced, "Code Silver." Code Silver. "Security breach in Computer Lab 3. "He knows," Marcus said, his face pale. "Somehow Crawford figured out what we're doing." Through the lab's window, Sarah could see security guards rushing toward their location. But these weren't the usual hospital security personnel. These were armed men in expensive suits, moving with military precision. "The back exit," Marcus said, grabbing the memory card and Sarah's arm. "Now!" They ran through corridors Sarah barely recognized, taking service elevators and maintenance passages that Marcus navigated with the expertise of someone who'd worked in the hospital for years. Behind them, they could hear footsteps and radio chatter as Crawford's people systematically searched the building. How did he know? Sarah panted as they reached a storage room near the parking garage. "I don't know, but it doesn't matter now," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone. "We need to get this evidence to the FBI before—" The storage room door burst open, and Dr. Crawford stepped inside, flanked by 2 armed men Sarah didn't recognize. He was still wearing his surgical scrubs, but there was nothing medical about the cold fury in his eyes. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his cultured voice carrying a note of disappointment. "I really hoped you'd be smart enough to let sleeping dogs lie. Like my grandfather did?" Sarah shot back, surprising herself with her own courage. "Like David Santos and all the other people you murdered." Crawford's smile was razor-thin. "Your grandfather was a meddlesome old man who couldn't appreciate the greater good. Do you have any idea how many lives I've saved with my work? How many wealthy philanthropists have donated millions to this hospital because I gave them the gift of life? I mean because you murdered innocent people to steal their organs." I prefer to think of it as resource reallocation, Crawford replied. A homeless man's heart can save a Nobel Prize winner. A drug addict's liver can preserve a brilliant scientist. I've been playing God, yes, but in the service of advancing human civilization. Marcus stepped protectively in front of Sarah. You're insane. I'm practical, Crawford corrected. And now I need to be practical about the two of you. One of the armed men stepped forward, but before he could move further, the storage room filled with armed FBI agents. Agent Morrison led the charge, her weapon trained on Crawford while her team efficiently disarmed his hired security. Dr. William Crawford, she announced, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, organ trafficking, and about 40 other federal charges. Crawford's composure finally cracked. You can't prove anything. I'm a respected physician. I've saved thousands of lives. Sarah stepped forward, holding up the memory card like a talisman. Actually, we can prove everything. My grandfather made sure of that. As Crawford was read his rights and led away in handcuffs, Sarah felt a strange sense of completion. 3 years of questions, 3 years of grief. 3 years of wondering what had really happened in her grandfather's final hours. All of it was finally answered. But the real victory wasn't just catching her grandfather's killer. It was knowing that dozens of future victims would live, because one Southside nurse had refused to let the powerful get away with murder. Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared in the doorway, having successfully recovered from her fake illness. Is it over? Sarah nodded, thinking about her grandfather's final words and the promise she'd finally been able to keep. It's over. The main atrium of Chicago General erupted into chaos as FBI agents led Dr. Crawford through the gala in handcuffs. The sight of their celebrated cardiac surgeon, the man who'd just been delivering a keynote speech about medical ethics, being arrested for murder sent shockwaves through Chicago's medical establishment. Sarah stood at the mezzanine overlooking the scene, watching as years of carefully constructed lies crumbled in real time. Board members demanded explanations. Donors clutched their pearls and whispered about their philanthropic reputations. Medical residents who'd worshipped Crawford looked like their world was ending, which in many ways it was. Ladies and gentlemen, Agent Morrison's voice carried clearly through the atrium as she addressed the stunned crowd. I'm Special Agent Morrison with the FBI Healthcare Fraud Division. Dr. William Crawford is being arrested in connection with a multi-year conspiracy involving the murder of patients and illegal organ trafficking. The gasps and shocked exclamations from the crowd were audible even from Sarah's vantage point. She watched as Dr. Crawford was paraded past tables full of Chicago's elite, people who'd celebrated him, donated millions based on his reputation, trusted him with their own medical care. The investigation is ongoing, Agent Morrison continued, but preliminary evidence suggests that Dr. Crawford systematically murdered dozens of patients over the past 5 years, selling their organs on the black market to wealthy buyers willing to pay premium prices for immediate transplants. A woman in diamonds fainted. A hospital board member was seen frantically making phone calls. The mayor of Chicago, who'd been scheduled to present Crawford with a humanitarian award, quietly slipped out a side exit. But Sarah's attention was focused on Crawford himself. Even in handcuffs, he maintained an air of superiority, his chin raised as if he were the victim of some terrible misunderstanding rather than a serial killer finally facing justice. As the agents led him toward the exit, Crawford's eyes found Sarah's through the crowd. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Sarah saw something in his expression that chilled her to the bone. Not remorse or fear, but calculation. Even now, even facing life in prison, he was planning something. He's not done, she whispered to Elena, who joined her on the mezzanine. What do you mean? Elena asked. Look at his face. He thinks he's going to get away with this. Elena followed Sarah's gaze and frowned. The evidence is overwhelming. Your grandfather documented everything. But Crawford spent 5 years building this operation. You think he doesn't have contingency plans? Backup evidence that implicates others? Ways to bargain his way to a reduced sentence? As if summoned by her words, Agent Morrison appeared beside them. Ms. Mitchell, Dr. Vasquez, we need to talk privately. They followed the agent to a conference room away from the chaos, where Marcus was already waiting with several other FBI personnel. The room felt like a war room. with laptops displaying financial records and photographs covering every available surface. "We've had a chance to review the evidence on your grandfather's memory card," Agent Morrison began. "It's exactly what we needed to crack this case wide open. But there's something you need to know." She pulled out a photograph that made Sarah's blood freeze. It showed her grandfather shaking hands with Dr. Crawford in what appeared to be a friendly meeting. Both men smiling at the camera. "Your grandfather wasn't just investigating Dr. Crawford," Agent Morrison said quietly. "He was working with us. He'd been an undercover informant for the FBI for 6 months before his death." The room spun slightly around Sarah. "What?" "Thomas Mitchell contacted our healthcare fraud division after noticing irregularities in the cardiac unit. We asked him to gather evidence while maintaining his cover as a concerned former hospital volunteer." Agent Morrison's expression was grim. "We were supposed to extract him before Crawford became suspicious. We failed." Sarah sank into a chair, the implications crashing over her like a wave. Her grandfather hadn't just stumbled onto Crawford's operation. He'd been deliberately investigating it. He'd known the risks, known that Crawford was dangerous, and he'd chosen to gather evidence anyway. "Why didn't you protect him?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We tried. We had surveillance on Crawford, but he was more paranoid than we anticipated. He discovered the investigation and moved faster than we expected." Agent Morrison leaned forward. "Your grandfather's death wasn't just murder, Ms. Mitchell. It was the assassination of a federal informant." Marcus reached over and squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "That means Crawford isn't just facing murder charges. This is a federal case now. No plea bargains, no reduced sentences. But there's more," Agent Morrison continued. "Crawford's operation was bigger than we initially thought. The evidence suggests he was part of an international organ trafficking network with connections to medical facilities in at least 12 countries. Taking him down is just the beginning." She pulled out another document, this one showing a list of names Sarah didn't recognize. "These are other physicians, medical administrators, and even some government officials who were part of the conspiracy. Your grandfather's evidence is going to help us dismantle the entire network." Sarah stared at the list, thinking about all the victims whose names weren't written anywhere. Patients who trusted their doctors and paid with their lives. Her grandfather's sacrifice hadn't just exposed one killer. It had revealed a global conspiracy that had been operating in plain sight for years. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Now we finish what Thomas Mitchell started," Agent Morrison replied. "We use his evidence to bring down everyone involved in this network, and we make sure that what happened here never happens again." As they prepared to leave the conference room, Agent Morrison pulled Sarah aside. "Your grandfather left something for you," she said, handing Sarah a sealed envelope. "He asked us to give this to you if something happened to him." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope and found a letter in her grandfather's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then my mission is complete, even if it cost me my life. I want you to know that every choice I made was worth it, because it led to justice for the innocent people Crawford murdered. You have healing hands, Sarah girl, but remember that sometimes the greatest healing comes from exposing the disease that's been hiding in the darkness. You've grown into exactly the woman I always knew you'd become. Brave, compassionate, and unwilling to let evil triumph. Wear my bracelet with pride, knowing that it helped bring a killer to justice. All my love." Grandpa Thomas. Sarah looked down at her wrist, where the silver bracelet now rested, returned to its rightful owner after 3 years in the hands of a murderer. The metal felt warm against her skin, like her grandfather's approval reaching across time. She'd kept her promise. She hadn't let them erase who they were, and she'd made sure that Thomas Mitchell's sacrifice meant something. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a packed courtroom as Dr. William Crawford's trial reached its climax. The federal prosecutor had just finished presenting the mountain of evidence that Thomas Mitchell had died gathering. Financial records, patient files, recorded conversations, and most damning of all, video footage of Crawford administering lethal injections to unsuspecting patients. Crawford sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that looked obscene on a man who'd once commanded respect in designer suits. His expensive legal team had tried every defense they could think of. Temporary insanity, coercion by international crime syndicates, even claiming that the organ trafficking had been conducted without his knowledge by rogue hospital staff. Nothing had worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, the testimony too damning, the video recordings too clear. Sarah had testified for 2 days, describing her grandfather's investigation and the discovery of his hidden evidence. She'd faced Crawford's defense attorneys as they tried to paint her as a grieving granddaughter whose emotions had clouded her judgment, seeking revenge against an innocent physician, but the jury had seen through their tactics. They'd watched the videos of Crawford murdering patients. They'd reviewed the financial records showing millions of dollars in blood money. They'd heard testimony from families who trusted Crawford with their loved ones' lives, only to have those lives stolen for profit. Now, as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict, the courtroom was so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, and we find the defendant guilty. Crawford's shoulders sagged slightly, but his expression remained defiant. On the charge of operating an illegal organ trafficking enterprise, we find the defendant guilty. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes, but she forced herself to remain composed. On the charge of healthcare fraud, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman continued through 47 separate charges, each one representing a life Crawford had destroyed in his quest for profit. 47 guilty verdicts that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in federal prison. When the foreman finished, Judge Patricia Wong addressed the courtroom with the gravity the moment deserved. Dr. Crawford, you have been found guilty of crimes that shock the conscience of civilized society. You took an oath to first do no harm, yet you systematically murdered dozens of innocent people for financial gain. Crawford finally spoke, his voice carrying none of its former authority. Your Honor, I maintain my innocence. I was a healer, not a killer. History will vindicate my work. Judge Wong's expression hardened. History will remember you as a serial killer who hid behind a medical degree. I sentence you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole, plus 200 years for the additional charges. As the bailiffs led Crawford away, he turned back to look at Sarah one final time. She met his gaze steadily, no longer the intimidated nurse who'd once cowered under his authority. She was Thomas Mitchell's granddaughter, and she'd kept her promise to ensure that justice was served. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was surrounded by reporters shouting questions about her grandfather's investigation and her role in exposing the conspiracy. Agent Morrison had prepared her for this moment, coaching her on how to handle the media attention while protecting the ongoing investigation into Crawford's international connections. Ms. Mitchell, called a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, what do you think your grandfather would say about today's verdict? Sarah thought about the question carefully before answering. I think he'd say that justice was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And I think he'd be proud that his sacrifice helped save future victims. What's next for you? Asked another reporter. I'm returning to nursing, Sarah said simply. There are patients who need care, and that's what my grandfather taught me I was born to do. But privately, Sarah knew her life had changed in ways she was still discovering. Agent Morrison had offered her a position with the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division, recognizing her unique combination of medical knowledge and investigative instincts. Several hospitals had reached out about positions in their ethics departments, wanting someone with her experience in identifying medical corruption. Most surprisingly, the Thomas Mitchell Foundation, established with recovered funds from Crawford's offshore accounts, had asked Sarah to serve as its director. The foundation's mission was to train healthcare workers to recognize and report medical fraud, ensuring that other families wouldn't experience the loss and betrayal that Sarah had endured. As the crowd of reporters began to disperse, Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared beside Sarah. How are you holding up? Better than I expected, Sarah replied honestly. It feels like I can finally breathe again. Elena nodded, understanding. She'd testified extensively about Crawford's pattern of suspicious patient deaths and had emerged as a leader in the hospital's efforts to rebuild trust with the community. Your grandfather would be proud, she said. You didn't just get justice for him, you prevented countless future victims. Sarah touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, feeling its familiar weight. She'd had it appraised after the trial, curious about its monetary value. The appraiser had been surprised to discover that it was worth far more than a typical piece of jewelry. The silver was unusually pure, the craftsmanship exceptional. But Sarah already knew the bracelet's real value had nothing to do with money. It was a reminder of promises kept, justice served, and the power of ordinary people to stand up against extraordinary evil. Marcus approached, carrying a folder thick with documents. The Hospital Ethics Committee wants to review every patient death in the cardiac unit for the past 7 years, he reported. They're also implementing new oversight protocols to prevent anything like Crawford's operation from happening again. Sarah smiled at the irony. Crawford's reign of terror had led to reforms that would make Chicago General safer for future patients. Even in death, her grandfather was still protecting the vulnerable. As they walked away from the courthouse together, Sarah, Elena and Marcus, 3 ordinary hospital employees who'd brought down a killer, Sarah felt her grandfather's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. She'd kept her promise. She hadn't let them be erased, and she'd learned that sometimes the greatest healing did indeed come from cutting out the disease. 1 year after Dr. Crawford's conviction, Sarah stood in the newly renovated cardiac unit of Chicago General, watching as nurses moved efficiently through their rounds with a confidence and openness that had been missing during Crawford's reign. The changes went far beyond new policies and oversight committees. There was a fundamental shift in the hospital's culture, a return to the healing mission that had drawn Sarah to nursing in the first place. Ms. Mitchell, a young resident, approached her with the respectful deference that still made Sarah uncomfortable. Since the trial, she'd become something of a legend among the hospital staff, the nurse who'd brought down a serial killer and exposed a global conspiracy. "The patient in room 314 is asking for you specifically." Sarah made her way to the room, where she found Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman recovering from routine cardiac surgery. The procedure had been performed by Dr. Vasquez, who'd taken over as head of the cardiac surgery department after Crawford's arrest. "Nurse Sarah," Mrs. Chen said, her face lighting up with a smile, "I wanted to thank you before I go home tomorrow." "Thank me for what?" Sarah asked, checking the woman's vitals out of habit. "For making me feel safe here. My daughter told me about what happened with that terrible doctor, and she was worried about letting me have surgery at this hospital. But I told her, if Nurse Sarah works there, then it must be a good place." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, remembering all the patients who hadn't felt safe during Crawford's tenure, patients who'd sensed something wrong, but hadn't been able to articulate their concerns. "You were in excellent hands with Dr. Vasquez," she said. "She's one of the finest surgeons I've ever worked with. But you're the one who made sure the bad doctors couldn't hurt anyone," Mrs. Chen insisted. "You're a hero, dear." Sarah left Mrs. Chen's room with mixed emotions. The word hero still felt wrong to her. She'd simply refused to let her grandfather's death go unavenged. But she was beginning to understand that sometimes heroism was exactly that simple, refusing to accept injustice. Even when fighting, it seemed impossible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Morrison. "Can you meet me in the coffee shop across from the hospital? Something important to discuss." 20 minutes later, Sarah sat across from the FBI agent who'd become an unlikely friend over the past year. Morrison looked tired but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd just completed a long and difficult mission. "It's over," Morrison said without preamble. "We just arrested the last members of Crawford's international network. 73 people in 12 countries, all facing charges related to illegal organ trafficking." Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying finally lift from her shoulders. "All of them?" "Every single one. The evidence your grandfather gathered didn't just expose Crawford. It gave us the thread we needed to unravel the entire conspiracy. We estimate that this network was responsible for over 400 deaths worldwide. 400 lives." Sarah tried to wrap her mind around the scope of what her grandfather had helped prevent. All those families who would never have to experience the grief and confusion she'd endured. All those patients who would live because their organs wouldn't be harvested by predatory doctors. "Your grandfather's sacrifice saved a lot of lives, Sarah," Morrison said quietly. "I hope you know that." Sarah nodded, touching the silver bracelet on her wrist. She wore it every day now, not as a memento of loss, but as a reminder of purpose. "He'd be proud of what we accomplished." Morrison slid a folder across the table. "There's something else. The Department of Justice is creating a new task force specifically focused on healthcare fraud and medical corruption. They want you to lead the victim advocacy division. Sarah opened the folder and saw an official job offer with the kind of salary and benefits she'd never dreamed of as a floor nurse. But more important than the money was the mission statement: to ensure that no family experiences what the Mitchell family endured, and to give victims' families a voice in the pursuit of justice. "I'd be leaving nursing," Sarah said, though she was already knowing what her answer would be. "You'd be expanding it," Morrison corrected, "using your medical knowledge and investigative experience to protect patients on a national scale. Think about it. Instead of caring for individual patients, you'd be working to safeguard the entire healthcare system." Sarah thought about her grandfather's words, "You have healing hands, Sarah girl." Maybe healing hands weren't just for individual patients. Maybe they were also for healing broken systems and corrupted institutions. "When would I start?" she asked. Morrison smiled. "Next month, if you're interested. There's a case in Miami that has some similarities to Crawford's operation. We could use your expertise." As Sarah walked back into Chicago General for what might be one of her last shifts as a floor nurse, she felt her grandfather's presence stronger than ever. The hospital looked different now, brighter somehow, as if Crawford's removal had lifted a shadow she hadn't even noticed was there. In the cardiac unit, she found Marcus updating patient charts with his characteristic attention to detail. He looked up as she approached, immediately sensing something significant in her expression. "You're leaving, aren't you?" he said. Sarah nodded, explaining the FBI offer and the new task force. Marcus listened without interrupting, then smiled with genuine happiness. "Thomas would be so proud," he said. "His granddaughter, protecting patients across the entire country." As Sarah completed her rounds that evening, she stopped by each patient's room, not just to check vitals, but to really see them, to acknowledge their trust and vulnerability, to honor the sacred relationship between healer and patient that Crawford had so callously violated. In the last room, she found a young mother recovering from heart surgery, her infant daughter sleeping peacefully in a crib beside the bed. The scene reminded Sarah why she'd become a nurse in the first place: to be present in moments when people needed care, compassion and protection most. The silver bracelet caught the light as Sarah adjusted the woman's IV line, and for a moment, she could swear she heard her grandfather's voice. "Sometimes healing means cutting out the disease, Sarah girl. And sometimes it means making sure the disease can never spread again." Sarah Mitchell had kept her promise to remember who they were. Now she was ready to help the whole world remember what healing was supposed to look like. Outside the hospital windows, Chicago sparkled in the evening light, a city where patients could once again trust their doctors, where families could believe that hospitals were sanctuaries rather than hunting grounds. The silver bracelet on Sarah's wrist wasn't just a memento anymore. It was a badge of honor, a symbol of justice served, and a promise that some fights are always worth having. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with courage, truth, and the refusal to let evil hide in plain sight. What would you do if you discovered a terrible secret about someone you were supposed to trust? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else to find their voice.